Imagine this. You're driving home after a long night, exhausted but content, looking forward to the comfort of your own home. Then, out of nowhere, flashing red and blue lights fill your rearview mirror. Your heart skips a beat. You weren't speeding, you didn't break any laws, but now you're being told to pull over. At first, you think it's a routine stop. But then, the questions start. The accusations, the suspicion in their voices. They don't tell you why you're being detained. They search your car without permission. And suddenly you realize this isn't about the law. This is about you. That's exactly what happened to Victoria Carter. A simple drive home turned into a nightmare of fear, humiliation, and injustice. But what the officers didn't know, her husband was the chief of police. And when he arrived, everything changed. So, what really happened that night? How did his empty traffic stop spiral so out of control? And what did her husband that left the entire department speechless? Let's start this story together. Hit the like button, leave a comment, make sure to subscribe. Because this is a story you won't forget, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. Victoria adjusted the rearview mirror of her navy blues Sedna as the hum of city traffic faded into the quiet streets of Charleston, South Carolina. The evening air was warm, thick, with the lingering scent of salt from the nearby harbor. She had just left a charity gala at a historic downtown venue, an event dedicated to raising funds for underprivileged youth. At 38 years old, Victoria had devoted much of her time to community work, balancing her career as an art curator with philanthropy. Tonight had been a success, but more than anything, she was eager to get home to her two young children. Her phone buzzed from the passenger seat. It was her husband, Nathan Carter, the newly appointed police chief of Charleston. She smiled softly, whispering to herself, "Be home soon," as she ignored the call. Then, the sudden flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror shattered the peaceful drive. A police cruiser. Her brows furrowed in confusion. She wasn't speeding. She hadn't missed a stop sign. She hadn't even touched her phone. Why was she being pulled over? She exhaled, slowing the car to a stop on the dimly lit roadside. As she rolled down her window, an officer, a tall man with a square jaw and a stern expression, approached briskly. "License and registration," he demanded without preamble. Victoria handed over her documents without hesitation. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I'm being stopped?" The officer barely glanced at her license before responding in a clipped tone. "We received a report about a vehicle matching this description being involved in suspicious activity in this area." Her heart skipped a beat. Suspicious activity? That made no sense. "I'm sorry, but that must be a mistake. I just left a fundraiser." Her voice was steady, but she could feel the unease creeping in. "Step out of the car, ma'am." Victoria blinked. "Excuse me?" Now, his tone hardened, leaving no room for argument. Before she could react, another cruiser pulled up behind them. Two more officers stepped out, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. The weight of their stares made her stomach churn. Her hand trembled slightly as she unbuckled her seatbelt, but she kept her hands visible, just as Nathan had taught her. "Stay calm. Stay controlled." "I'm complying," she said firmly, stepping out into the warm night air. "But I'd like to understand why I'm being treated this way." The lead officer ignored her and motioned toward the second officer, who immediately began rifling through her car without permission. He tossed aside a neatly stacked pile of brochures from the gala, flipping through them as if searching for contraband. "Hey," Victoria protested, "you can't just search my car without a warrant or probable cause." One of the younger officers, looking slightly nervous, muttered, "Just doing our job, ma'am." Her patience thinned. "Then at least let me call my husband," the officer scoffed. "You can do that when we're done." Frustration boiled inside her, but she bit her tongue. She wouldn't give them a reason to escalate. Instead, she glanced at her phone, still buzzing with another incoming call from Nathan. "May I retrieve my phone?" she asked, voice measured. The officers exchanged glances. "No sudden movements," one warned, as if she were a threat. Slowly, carefully, Victoria reached into the car and grabbed her phone. The officers looked almost disappointed when she did nothing remotely suspicious. But they weren't finished. "We're running your plates and license," one officer called out. She crossed her arms, her pulse hammering in her ears. They had no reason to treat her this way. Taking a breath, she dialed Nathan's number. "Victoria?" His voice was sharp with concern. "I've been trying to call you. What's going on?" "Pulled over. No cause. They're searching my car. I need you here, now." His tone changed instantly, from concern to controlled fury. "Where are you?" She gave him her location. "Please hurry." As she ended the call, she noticed the officers watching her more closely, their postures stiffening. They had no idea who she had just called. But they were about to find out. Minutes crawled by. The officers continued their so-called investigation, though they had found nothing. But then, the deep roar of an approaching SUV broke the silence. A sleek black vehicle pulled up, and the driver's door swung open. Nathan Carter stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed sharply in a crisp suit, he looked every bit the authoritative figure he was. His police badge gleamed under the streetlights, clipped to his belt. The officers stiffened. The air shifted. "Good evening." His voice was smooth, but edged with unmistakable steel. "I'm Chief Nathan Carter. Someone want to explain why my wife is being detained and her car searched without cause?" The lead officer swallowed hard. "Sir, we were responding to a report of suspicious activity." Nathan took a slow, deliberate step closer. "Suspicious activity? In a sedan driven by a woman in an evening gown coming from a charity event?" The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. Nathan's voice hardened. "Tell me, did she give you permission to search her vehicle?" Silence. "That's what I thought." By now, a few passing cars had slowed, drivers peering curiously at the scene. Some people had even stopped on the sidewalk, pulling out their phones to record. Victoria finally spoke, her voice unwavering. "Nathan, they wouldn't even let me make a phone call at first." Nathan turned back to the officers, his eyes dark with restrained fury. "Do you realize the liability you've just put this department in?" The lead officer's jaw clenched. "Sir, we were just—" "Enough." Nathan's voice cut through the air. "Call your supervisor. Now." The officers hesitated, but they had no choice. The real reckoning was about to begin. The older officer hesitated, his Adam's apple bobbing as he tried to keep his posture firm. "Sir, we were following up on a report." Malcolm took a step forward, his gaze unwavering. "A report?" His voice was dangerously calm. "And did this report specify anything other than a vague suspicious activity involving a generic sedan?" The officer shifted uncomfortably. "We're just doing our job." "Your job?" Malcolm repeated, his tone now carrying an unmistakable edge. "Tell me, officer, at what point did your job include violating the civil rights of a woman driving home from a charity event? At what point did it include searching her car without probable cause?" The younger officer, the one who had seemed nervous before, spoke up. "Sir, we didn't know who she was." Malcolm's lips pressed into a thin line. He let the words hang in the air for a moment before responding. "And why should that matter?" His voice was quiet, but carried a weight that made the officers stiffen. "Would you have treated her any differently if she was just an average citizen? Because that's the real problem here, isn't it?" The older officer bristled. "Sir, we weren't profiling." "Weren't you?" Malcolm's question cut through the night air like a blade. He gestured toward the bystanders who were still watching, their phone screens glowing in the darkness. "Because everyone here seems to have a different opinion." A murmur of agreement rippled through the small crowd. Some had their arms crossed, others whispered amongst themselves, and more than a few still had their phones raised, recording every second. Victoria finally spoke, her voice steady but laced with exhaustion. "Nathan, they wouldn't even let me make a phone call at first." Malcolm inhaled sharply. He turned to his wife, his expression softening for just a moment before his fury returned. He faced the officers once again. "Call your supervisor, now." The older officer hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. "I wasn't making a request," Malcolm added, his voice like steel. With obvious reluctance, the officer reached for his radio. "Dispatch, requesting a supervisor at my location." His voice lacked the confidence he displayed earlier. The radio crackled, then a response. "Copy that. Lieutenant Donovan is en route." Malcolm gave a curt nod. "Good. Now, while we wait, let's go over a few things. You claim you were just doing your job, but what I see is a gross abuse of power. I see an overreach, a failure in judgment, and a situation that's about to become a major liability for this department." Neither officer spoke. The younger one kept darting glances toward his partner, clearly realizing how deep they were sinking. Minutes passed, heavy with tension. A few more cars slowed as they passed, their drivers craning their necks to see what was happening. Then, the wail of an approaching siren broke the silence. A black and white SUV pulled up, and a tall, broad-shouldered man in a neatly pressed uniform stepped out. Lieutenant Charles Donovan. His sharp gaze swept over the scene. Victoria standing stiffly beside her car, Malcolm standing protectively near her, the two officers looking distinctly uncomfortable, and the growing crowd watching the events unfold. "Commissioner Carter," Donovan greeted, his voice carefully neutral. "What seems to be the issue here?" Malcolm's jaw tightened. "The issue, Lieutenant, is that my wife was pulled over without cause, interrogated, and had her car searched illegally. Your officers failed to provide any legitimate reason for their actions. They've overstepped, and they know it." Donovan's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. He turned to the officers. "Is this true? Did you search her vehicle without probable cause?" The older officer hesitated. We received a report." "And did you confirm the details of that report before deciding to detain her?" Donovan's tone was sharper now. The younger officer swallowed hard. "No, sir." Malcolm folded his arms. "And there it is." Donovan exhaled, running a hand down his face. He looked back at Malcolm. "Commissioner, I assure you this will be handled." Malcolm didn't back down. "I don't want assurances, Lieutenant. I want accountability." He gestured toward the bystanders. "You see all these people? They're not just watching. They're recording. And tomorrow morning, this department will be trending for all the wrong reasons." Donovan clenched his jaw. He turned back to his officers. "Return her belongings, now." The older officer stiffly nodded and moved toward Victoria's car, tossing the stack of brochures haphazardly back into the trunk. The younger officer stepped forward. "Ma'am, you're free to go. We, apologize for the misunderstanding." Victoria met his eyes and held his gaze. "No, you don't." Her voice was calm but unwavering. "Because if you did, this wouldn't have happened in the first place." The younger officer had the decency to look ashamed. The older officer said nothing. Malcolm took a step closer to Donovan. "I expect a full report on my desk first thing in the morning, and I expect disciplinary action to be taken against these officers. If I don't see real consequences, I'll make sure this department answers to the public instead." Donovan nodded tightly. "Understood, sir." Malcolm finally turned back to Victoria. "Are you all right?" She nodded, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Let's just go home." As they walked back to their SUV, the tension in the air remained thick. The officers stood in rigid silence, the bystanders murmured, and the glow of phone screens still dotted the night. As Malcolm opened the driver's side door for Victoria, he paused. He turned back toward the officers one last time. "This is exactly why we still have so much work to do." Then, with one final glance at Donovan, he slid into the SUV. Victoria followed, and together they drove off, leaving behind a shaking group of officers and a story that would not be forgotten. But the night's events were far from over. By morning, the fallout would begin. The video of the confrontation had already gone viral. News outlets picked it up, social media erupted, and the words "abuse of power" and "racial profiling" were being thrown around like fire in dry grass. The hashtags "Justice for Victoria" and "Accountability Matters" trended nationwide. People weren't just talking. They were angry. Inside his office at the Charleston Police Department, Chief Nathan Carter scrolled through his phone, reading article after article dissecting the night's events. The footage was damning. It showed Victoria, composed but clearly distressed, while the officers treated her like a suspect. It captured every word of his confrontation with them, the growing crowd, and the weight of the moment. Nathan had faced crises before, but this was different. A knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he said, his voice tight. Lieutenant Charles Donovan entered, his usual confidence dampened. He shut the door behind him, his expression unreadable. "Sir," Donovan began, choosing his words carefully. "We have a situation." Nathan let out a short, humorless laugh. "You think?" He gestured to his phone. "Do you know how many calls I've gotten in the last 3 hours? The mayor, the city council, even the governor's office. This is bigger than just a situation, Lieutenant." Donovan sighed. "I understand, sir. The officers involved have been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. We're reviewing body cam footage now." Nathan's jaw clenched. And what do you think that footage will show? Donovan hesitated. He knew the answer. Nothing justifies what happened. Nathan leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. This department cannot afford another scandal, Donovan. We've been pushing for accountability, for reform. And then something like this happens? If we don't handle this the right way, we'll lose what little trust the public still has in us. Donovan nodded. I agree. The community is already organizing protests. There's talk of a press conference. Nathan exhaled. Then we need to get ahead of this before it spirals even further. He stood. Call a department-wide meeting. I want everyone in that briefing room in 1 hour. Donovan left without another word, and Nathan took a moment to compose himself. He rubbed his temples before reaching for his phone and dialing Victoria. She picked up after the first ring. Hey, she said, her voice quieter than usual. How are you holding up? A pause. I'm tired. Nathan shut his eyes for a moment. I know. The kids saw the news this morning, she continued. I had to explain why Mommy was on TV, why the police treated me that way. Nathan's grip on the phone tightened. Damn it. It's okay, she said, though they both knew it wasn't. But what happens now in meeting? There will be consequences for the officers involved, I promise you that. She exhaled. Good. But Nathan, this can't just be about me. This isn't just my story. You know that. He did. I know, he said softly. I'll call you after the meeting, all right? She murmured her agreement before hanging up. An hour later, the Charleston Police Department's briefing room was packed. Officers filled the rows of chairs, some whispering amongst themselves, others scrolling through their phones, reading the same news Nathan had seen earlier. When Nathan walked in, the room fell silent. He stepped to the front, taking a slow look around before speaking. You've all seen the video. His voice was steady but cold. You all know what happened last night, and let me be clear, this department is at a crossroads. He let the words sink in before continuing. We talk a lot about serving and protecting, about trust, about integrity. But what happened last night? He shook his head. That was the opposite of everything we claim to stand for. He could see some officers shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Others sat stone-faced, arms crossed. There will be accountability, Nathan continued. The officers involved have been placed on leave, and an independent review will determine further action. But this isn't just about them. This is about all of us. Because if we don't change, if we don't do better, then we are failing this city. A hand went up. It was Sergeant Calloway, an officer Nathan respected. Chief, Calloway said, some of the guys are saying this is being blown out of proportion, that the media is twisting the story. Nathan's gaze hardened. Blown out of proportion? He gestured toward the screen behind him where a still frame from the video was displayed. Tell me, Sergeant, does this look like the media twisting the story, or does it look like exactly what it is? Calloway had no answer. Nathan exhaled. I don't care what your opinions are outside of this uniform, but if you wear this badge, then you will treat every single citizen with the respect they deserve. If you can't do that, then turn in your badge right now. Silence. Then, slowly, Calloway nodded. Nathan surveyed the room one last time. Dismissed. As the officers filed out, Donovan approached. That was intense. It needed to be, Nathan replied. Donovan nodded. The press conference is in 2 hours. The mayor wants to speak. Nathan sighed. Then we better be ready. Because this wasn't over. Not even close. The press conference was minutes away, and the air inside City Hall was suffocating. Nathan stood in the hallway outside the chamber, his mind racing. The walls around him were lined with aides, legal advisors, and city officials, all whispering in hushed tones. Behind the double doors, reporters were packed shoulder to shoulder, waiting for a statement, waiting for blood. Lieutenant Donovan stood beside him, his expression tight. Chief, the mayor wants to go first. Nathan exhaled sharply. Of course he does. And he wants you to keep it under control. Nathan turned his head slowly, his eyes cold. Last night my wife was humiliated and unlawfully searched by men wearing this uniform. You think I'm interested in keeping things under control? Donovan swallowed hard but said nothing. Before Nathan could say another word, the heavy doors swung open. A city official motioned for them. They're ready. Nathan squared his shoulders and stepped inside. The room was chaos. Cameras flashed, microphones clustered in a tangled mess. Reporters threw out questions before anyone even reached the podium. Chief Carter, is it true your wife was racially profiled? Commissioner, do you plan on pressing charges against your own officers? Mayor Thompson, what steps is the city taking to prevent further abuses of power? Mayor Robert Thompson raised his hands, signaling for silence. Slowly, the voices died down. The tension, however, remained razor-sharp. The mayor cleared his throat. Good afternoon. We are aware of the public outrage surrounding the incident involving Mrs. Victoria Carter and members of the Charleston Police Department. First and foremost, we want to assure the community that this matter is being taken very seriously. Nathan clenched his jaw. Empty words. Thompson continued. We have launched a full internal investigation. The officers involved have been placed on leave, and our administration is committed to transparency. However, he paused, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. I urge everyone to remain patient. This is a complex issue, and rushing to judgment does not serve justice. A murmur rippled through the press. Some reporters exchanged skeptical glances. Nathan stepped forward, gripping the edges of the podium. His voice was low, controlled, but sharp enough to cut steel. Let me be clear. What happened to my wife was not a complex issue. It was a failure of judgment, a failure of protocol, a failure of the system that we are sworn to uphold. The room went still. Nathan let the weight of his words settle before continuing. Victoria Carter was stopped without cause. She was interrogated without justification. Her vehicle was searched without consent. And for what? Because she was driving home in a nice car? Because she was wearing an evening gown instead of a uniform? A few gasps could be heard from the audience. Nathan's gaze swept over the crowd, daring anyone to challenge him. This is not just about my wife. This is about every citizen who has been stopped, searched, and treated like a suspect for no reason other than bias and bad policing. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating. Then a voice rang out from the press pool. Chief Carter, do you believe your officers were motivated by race? Nathan hesitated, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he knew the weight of his words. He took a slow breath. I believe that if Victoria Carter had looked different, she wouldn't have been treated that way. A stunned silence. Mayor Thompson stiffened beside him. Donovan exhaled, looking down at his shoes. But the reporters? They exploded. Chief, are you saying the department has a systemic problem? Do you plan to fire the officers involved? Are you pushing for criminal charges? Nathan raised a hand. The investigation will determine the final actions. But let me be clear. If you wear this badge and you cannot treat every citizen with respect, you do not deserve to wear it at all. Another wave of chaos. Reporters shouted over each other, demanding more answers. But Nathan had said enough. He stepped back from the podium, ignoring the flurry of questions. Mayor Thompson forced a tight smile, stepping forward to clean up the political mess Nathan had just created. Nathan didn't care. He turned, pushing through the doors into the hallway. Donovan followed, his steps quick. Jesus, Nathan, you just called out the entire force on live television. Nathan didn't break stride. Good, maybe they'll finally listen. Before Donovan could respond, Nathan's phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, his pulse spiking when he saw the name. Victoria. He answered immediately. I just finished. Her voice was quieter than usual. I saw. You didn't hold back. Nathan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. I couldn't, not after what they did to you. A pause. Then, softly, I'm proud of you. Nathan closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the words settle in his chest. Then a second call came through. Nathan glanced at the number, and his stomach dropped. Internal affairs. His grip on the phone tightened. Victoria, I need to go. I think things are about to get worse. She didn't ask questions, just whispered, Be careful. Nathan ended the call and answered the second. Carter, a deep voice responded. Chief, we have a problem, a big one. Nathan's blood turned to ice. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. By the time Nathan stepped out of City Hall, the world had already shifted. The press conference wasn't just a statement, it was a battle cry. The city was now watching, waiting to see if justice would truly be served or if this would become yet another empty promise swept under the rug. Nathan knew this wasn't over. The officers involved would face consequences. But the deeper problem, the systemic failure that allowed this to happen in the first place, would take far more than disciplinary action to fix. As he got into his SUV, his phone buzzed with an incoming text. It was from Victoria. "No matter what happens next, I'm proud of you." Nathan exhaled slowly. He had spent his entire career trying to change the system from within, believing that reform was possible. But now, standing at the crossroads of politics, public outrage, and personal conviction, he realized something painful. Change wouldn't come easy, but that didn't mean he wouldn't fight for it. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The video footage continued to circulate, bringing nationwide attention to the case. Protests formed outside the Charleston Police Department, demanding accountability beyond just suspensions. The mayor's office scrambled to contain the fallout, while political leaders debated whether Nathan had gone too far, or if he had finally spoken the truth too many had ignored for too long. The officers involved were placed under formal investigation. 2 of them resigned before the process even concluded, knowing their careers were over. The third, the lead officer who had ordered the illegal search, was fired and later charged with misconduct. But for Nathan and Victoria, this wasn't just about one night or one group of officers. It was about every person who had ever been stopped for looking suspicious. It was about every family who had felt that fear and humiliation. It was about making sure this never happened again. Victoria took her experience and turned it into a movement. She became an advocate, speaking at town halls, pushing for legislative changes, and demanding stricter policies on police accountability. Nathan knew this battle was far from over. Reform wasn't just about firing bad cops, it was about changing the culture that allowed them to exist in the first place. And so he continued the fight. Not just as a police chief, not just as a husband, but as a man who had seen firsthand how easily justice could be denied and who refused to let it happen again. What do you think? Let's talk about it. This story isn't just fiction. It reflects real issues that many people face every day. So now, I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Nathan's position? Do you think justice was truly served, or should more have been done? How can we create real change in law enforcement and our communities? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start a conversation that matters. And if you want more powerful stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss out. The fight for justice never ends, but together, we can make a difference.